I'd like to welcome you to the Austrian Circle. This is the program where we talk about the economics of freedom here on WHUS Stores 91.7 FM. So thank you very much for tuning into my show this morning. We are going to be talking about the drought in California and how prices and free markets can help to alleviate problems where people have a lack of resources available for their consumption. So in California, there's a big drought going on. They're running out of water. They don't have enough of it to water their lawns and do all of the things that they'd like to do with water. Growing crops is becoming more difficult because the lack of supply of water is driving people to not be able to use it. And so the government's response to this has been to demand that people stop using these resources, or at least limit their supply, so rationing and things like that. So they want water police to walk around the neighborhoods and inspect people to make sure that they're not watering their lawns or, taking too long of a shower or something like that. And this is a very common response when the government has a monopoly on the provision of a particular good or service. Then they usually insult the customer or make them feel bad and guilty about using that resource so that the customer will stop going in and buying that product. Now, how this would be handled in a free market would be that prices would rise in the response to the resources supply being diminished. So when gasoline is more scarce, people tend to consume less of it because the price of it is going up. People would look at that and say, well, do I really need to take that vacation this year? Maybe I'll take a plane if that's going to be less money, and maybe I won't drive my car and use those scarce resources of gasoline. I'm just going to cut back. So there's a natural conservation that occurs when we have prices, and prices rise when the supply of something is diminished. So in California, we would see water prices rising as they had less and less water. But right now, as the government is providing this service, there is no price structure where prices would rise and people would respond to that stimulus by cutting back on the use of those resources. Another benefit to having the price structure reflect the actual supply of water in this area is that companies would look at that price and say, hey, there's a lot of profitability to be had out there. I can only sell water for, say, $1 here, but I can sell water for $5 in California because the prices are so high, because the resources are so scarce. And so that encourages companies to think of new solutions to try and get more water over to California, and they are impelled to do so simply because of the profitability of the higher prices out in California. So maybe Colorado would think, hey, we'll build a pipeline and we'll get some of our Rocky Mountain snow to go over to California and supply water that way. Or maybe there would be desalination plants that would pop up in California because we would realize that it would be more profitable to build a desalination plant than to continue on with the higher prices of water and spend so much money on water, maybe for swimming pools and less important uses than drinking water. We can use the desalination plants. But again, this doesn't come about if we don't have prices, because then we don't have an incentive, and we also can't allocate our resources correctly. We have no idea whether we should spend money on new pipelines, or whether we should spend money on desalination plants, or whether we should just deal with the higher prices in water. We can't understand where we should allocate our resources without markets and prices and all of that wonderful stuff that comes along with private property and free markets. So I wanted to read an article to you today regarding this, and it was posted on the Mises Institute at mises.org, and it's called Government Water and Drought in California. This article is by Catherine Murator. Everyone is well aware of record snow in the Northeast and a drought in the West. I think back to when I was a Philadelphian who had never crossed the Mississippi and realized how foreign the weather of California is to the average East Coaster. In the San Francisco Bay Area and the Central Valley alike, it does not rain between April 1st and October 1st. I don't mean it doesn't rain much. I mean it does not rain at all. In the Bay Area, the winters are quite wet, with a light rain falling most days in certain areas. In Fresno and the rest of the Central Valley, rainfall totals 6 to 12 inches on average, with all of that accumulating from October to March. But we have the Sierra Nevadas to our east to catch moisture in the form of snow and store it for the dry season. The snow melts and, historically, flowed through large rivers such as the San Joaquin to the Pacific. Prior to federal water projects, steamboats came to dock in Fresno. And she points out here to a map of showing how much smaller the river is between now and 100 years ago. And she says there's a dam right outside of town, built during the New Deal, of course. And clearly, the state has not been a good steward of the environment, but at least clean water is getting to people who need it, right? It doesn't matter what constituency you belong to in California, chances are you are unhappy with your allocation or quality of water. Last week, it was announced that some farmers in the valley are getting cut out in the drought. They think the city folks in San Francisco and Los Angeles are taking more than their fair share. The city folks think industrial agriculture is taking more than its fair share. Residents across the state are constantly being admonished to conserve, with rationing of various types taking place. Cambria, a coastal community where fog is the predominant form of moisture, essentially ran out of water, and that was before the current statewide drought. Studies of tap water in poor agricultural communities show alarming levels of toxins, and of course, environmentalists are concerned about the effect of diverting water to people or wildlife. None of these special interests are specific to a drought. This is an ongoing battle, even in wet years. This year, however, the stakes are raised. Not only is rainfall low, but the snowpack in the Sierras is low. There hasn't been enough precipitation in the mountains, and when there has been precipitation, it has often been too warm for snow, and it has fallen in the form of rain. That gives us some water now, but does not bode well for the long, dry season ahead. Sadly, all eyes have turned to local water officials, Governor Jerry Brown, and of course, President Barack Obama. Obama recently came to visit the Central Valley for the first time ever for precisely this reason. The same constituencies have the same tired arguments and complaints, with no play being given to ideas outside of the box. It is no surprise to anyone who reads the history of the state's involvement in water issues. The status quo is ingrained, and it is extremely difficult to imagine an alternative. A transition out of this mess is even harder to imagine, but once you realize that it is not a question of if the system will fail, but when, you realize it is essential that we desocialize water in the arid West immediately. The total privatization of water is the best way to avert disaster in the arid West. The disaster is not necessarily imminent, but it is inevitable because there are no significant incentives to conserve this resource in its current socialized state. Privatization does not mean selling dams and reservoirs and municipal water companies to private investors, who are then allowed to operate as protected monopolies. Privatization means that you own the rights of the water on your land, and individuals can own real estate in water, lakes, rivers, oceans. A transition to such a state of affairs is likely to be painful, as 100-plus years of damage by socialization of water must be undone. But I am certain that the process will be relatively quick compared to the long, drawn-out suffering that is in store if water socialism is allowed to continue. I know that a private water supply would be an improvement over present conditions, but that is neither why I am in favor of it nor likely to persuade the mainstream. For those liberals who see that a free market in water certainly could be no worse than the economic and environmental destruction done by the government monopolies, a disdain for profit and a misguided faith in democracy prevents their endorsing of privatization. But the history of the Bureau of Reclamation and the present state of local, state, and federal water ownership shows that water is not controlled by a democratic process. The very existence of several disparate groups, each with their own agendas, has meant that special interests control the water. Western farmers have been receiving water subsidies paid for by taxpayers and will continue to receive special water allocation regardless of droughts or environmental lobbying because they currently supply an enormous amount of food to the nation and the world and constitute a substantial portion of the economy. Most farmers in the Valley and many residents of the Valley cities vote Republican and espouse free market rhetoric and a more individualistic attitude, except, of course, when it comes to water subsidies. It is always the Democrats in D.C. who are at fault when water is tight, but Valley residents seem to be unaware that it was the progressives of the past who built the dams and the aqueducts. Jim Powell's Bully Boy brings up an interesting point about the Homestead Act luring poor people to farm the arid lands out west. This had several repercussions: deaths due to harsh winters, a glut of farmers and farmland, later leading to more lobbying by farmers for relief, and a need for irrigation and distorting the market to invest capital in irrigation technologies. Rather than allow the West to remain unsettled as farmers and irrigation companies died, both figuratively and literally in the former case, Teddy Roosevelt's bizarre focus on preventing foreign invasion led him to break rank with the Republicans and provide irrigation subsidies to Western farmers. Powell adds, quote, "It was curious that Roosevelt, who crusaded against private monopolies, approved of the Reclamation Service as a dam-building monopoly. The Reclamation Act led to another market distortion and ultimately corruption. Land speculation took off as investors tried to predict where the feds would build a dam and encourage settlement. The Owens Valley scandal, in which water was unethically diverted from local irrigation to Los Angeles by the Reclamation Service, led to further distortions. The city government acquired the water monopoly and below-market water prices followed, encouraging a further increase in population." The story continues to the present day. Until last year, residential water in Fresno, delivered by the municipal water monopoly, was not metered. Residents were charged based on the size of their lot. To encourage conservation, the city enacted rationing laws. You can be fined for watering your garden or lawn on the wrong day and at the wrong time of the day. But the laws are openly ignored because enforcement is too costly. In addition to rationing, my husband tells me that there were public service announcement campaigns when he was growing up describing when one should and should not flush his or her toilet. In order to get residential metering to be politically palatable, promises were made that the average water bills would not be higher, so rates were set low enough to ensure that residents would not face suddenly higher bills. These rates are too low to be sustainable in that water use is continuing to lower the water supply faster than it is replenished by nature. To the shock of no one paying attention, after the water meters were approved and installed citywide, the city notified customers of proposed rate increases over the next several years. Hearings were held, and maybe one day water rates will increase, but probably not nearly enough to encourage true conservation. The kind of conservation that occurs when a free market pricing system encourages allocation of scarce resources is based on the most pressing needs. As Murray Rothbard wrote in 1977, quote, "If the water industry were free and competitive, the response to a drought would be very simple. Water would rise in price." We are in a drought and water prices have not increased on paper. The municipal bureaucracies cannot react quickly to changing conditions. Indeed, one may note that they can only react glacially. Water rates are a political question as much as they are an economic or ecological question. But for some farmers, water prices will increase to infinity in practice. There will be a government-induced shortage, and farmers will not be allowed to use more water, no matter how much they would be willing to pay. But the solution is not, as the local Tea Party implies, to continue to give farmers below-cost water while cutting off water to the big, liberal cities. There are parts of the West where farming does make sense and would continue to thrive in a free market water system. But the choice of crops, location of farms, and farming practices would have to be quite different from the average seen today. A distinct benefit of farming in the eastern Central Valley of California, where we can see the snowpack on the Sierras that ensure some amount of water for irrigation year-round, and where rivers and streams flowed before various government water projects dried them up, is that the growing seasons are very long, and indeed some vegetables can be grown year-round. Many vegetables have growing seasons that complement those where winters are harsh. Lettuce does not do well in our very hot summers, but thrives from early fall through mid-spring, precisely when it is not growing in the east. I know of a local organic farm that pumps water from wells on its land and eschews the aqueduct water allotment provided by the taxpayers out of principle. It can be done, but there is currently no economic incentive for the majority of valley farmers to conserve water and choose crops and farming practices that are a better match for the water supply. Thus, the big city liberals are correct that the valley farming practices are wasteful, and it is environmentally harmful to divert ever more water to the farms. The supposedly free market conservatives in the valley should understand that socialized water system will lead to waste. But I wonder if the big city liberals are aware of the environmental irresponsibility of enforcing city ownership of reservoirs hundreds of miles away. Returning to Powell's analysis in Bully Boy, the aims of government control of water are internally at odds with each other. Quote, Roosevelt's Inland Waterways Commission offered platitudes promising something for everybody. Plans for the improvement of navigation in inland waterways should take account of the purification of the waters, the development of power, the control of floods, the reclamation of lands by irrigation and drainage, and all other uses of the waters, or benefits to be derived from their control. But some of those aims conflicted with others. If the primary purpose of a dam was to produce hydroelectric power, there had to be a reasonably full reservoir behind it. If the primary purpose was flood control, however, a reservoir had to be empty so that there would be capacity for floodwater. If a reservoir was empty, or if water was substantially drawn down for irrigation or for industrial or household use, navigation would be impossible. And where does environmental stewardship come into play when the city must make sure that residents, tourists, and businesses have cheap running water so that they can continue to pay taxes to cover city officials' salaries? It is hardly a paradox why the special interests on the left to protect the environment and send water to the cities, and the right to protect the farmers, ignore the history of water in the West and the obvious failings of the present system. The alternative, of course, is unknown and unseen. The alternative has certainly never been seen by those currently living in the arid West, and that is a survival tactic for the biggest special water interests of all, the Bureau of Reclamation and the state and city water authorities. That article was called Government Water and Drought in California, and it was written by Catherine Moritor and posted on mises.org, the Mises Institute. The next article I would like to read is going along these same lines, and it was posted on the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE.org, and it is called Does California Need Rain, Rationing, or Prices? This article is by Daniel Beer, and the subtitle of this article is A Drought Doesn't Have to Cause Shortages. California is in the midst of a crisis. Its gorgeous weather has turned against it as its fourth year of drought drags on. Looming water shortages are leading to calls for rationing and restrictions on water use. The state has 1 year of water left and 35-year megadroughts ahead of it. The New York Times bleats, quote, reservoirs are low, landscapes are parched and blighted with fields of dead or dormant orange trees. Why is there a water shortage? Almost every news story I've read blames the drought. This sounds like a reasonable assumption, but just because the supply has contracted doesn't mean that there should be a shortage. In normal markets, when supply shrinks, the prices rise, and quantity demanded decreases to meet quantity supplied. People naturally use less when something costs more. They conserve and prioritize. But if for some reason the price can't rise, usage won't change because the price isn't signaling facts about underlying scarcity and incentivizing different behavior. What made sense to do with a resource when it was relatively abundant, say 40-minute showers and turning your lawn into a lake, might not make sense when it's scarcer. When the price is held down, while supply and demand are changing, you end up with shortages, rationing, and use regulations. As Alex Tabarrok points out, California has plenty of water. What it doesn't have are prices, or rather market prices. Although a lot of well-meaning people insist that water is a right, I notice that my right to water in no way changes the fact that I have to pay the government monopoly for it. So even if there is a right to water, as Tabarrok quotes Matt Kahn, there is no natural right to always pay half a cent per gallon for it, regardless of supply or demand. The price controls and subsidies for water use also have behavioral consequences. Quote, as David Zetland points out in an excellent interview with Russ Roberts, people in San Diego County use around 150 gallons of water a day. Meanwhile, in Sydney, Australia, with a roughly comparable climate and standard of living, people use about half that amount. Trust me, no one in Sydney is going thirsty. People in San Diego have lawns and cars and pour tons of water on them. And why not? It's cheap. But when water becomes scarcer, rather than raise prices to reflect this fact and encourage conservation, California cities resort to paternalistic rationing, issuing edicts about when you can water your lawn and how much and how clean your car can be. Water conservation, by any means necessary, as long as they don't involve prices, is also the basis for the myriad of ludicrous federal regulations that have devastated our toilets and showers, as Jeffrey Tucker has chronicled. Prices aren't just a way to avoid shortages and use resources efficiently, as David Zetland explains in his wonderful little book, Living with Water Scarcity. Markets treat consumers like free and responsible adults whose choices actually matter, rather than dictating to them what's important or essential for their own lives. Quote, prices generate revenues and reduce demand, but they also give customers choices. A regulation on outdoor watering may annoy a granny with flowers. A desalination plant may annoy environmentalists. An education campaign is condescending to some and a waste of breath on others. A campaign to install low-flow toilets may install sparkling receptacles in unused second bathrooms. Prices send a direct signal at the same time as they accommodate many responses. Customers can choose their own mix of technologies and techniques. Some will take shorter showers. Others will install drip irrigation. Some will shower at work. Others will just pay more. A higher price for water, like a higher price for any commodity, allows people to choose how much water to use. Choice is a pleasant option compared to water shortages or tickets from water cops. Markets can solve the shortage in California even if they can't make it rain, while water rationing won't do anything to alleviate the real problem because it exempts the biggest consumers. All the use restrictions are all a distraction. You could eliminate all car washes, showers, and lawns and not make a dent, because urban consumers account for just a fraction of California's water consumption. The Economist notes, quote, the first rule for staying alive in a desert is not to pour the contents of your water flask into the sand. Yet that, bizarrely, is what the government has encouraged farmers to do in the drought-afflicted Southwest. Agriculture accounts for 80% of water consumption in California, for example, but only 2% of economic activity. Farmers flood the land to grow rice, alfalfa, and other thirsty crops. And while it may be sad that some of California's farms are struggling, there is no logical reason why the rest of the state needs to suffer to subsidize crops and inefficient irrigation techniques. That wouldn't make economic sense if the farmers had to pay market rates for water. Tabarrok calculates that if farms used just 12.5% less water, Californians could theoretically increase the amount available for all industrial and residential uses by half. Does that arrangement make sense? Probably not, but no planner or regulator could possibly decide how to weigh the demands of millions of people for water or any scarce resource. All we know is that we do not have enough water to satisfy every possible use for it. Only the price system is able to coordinate those countless actors, factors, plans, interests, and industries. Maybe when California regulators turn on the tap and find it empty, they'll realize this. That article is by Daniel Beer, and it is called, Does California Need Rain, Rationing, or Prices? And again, it was posted on the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE.org. So, free markets are what allow people to rationally calculate how much they have of something and how much other people need of something, and what is the best way to use the resources that we have on this planet. We have a finite number of resources, no matter what we're actually talking about. Whether we're talking about steel, sand that makes glass, whether we're talking about water, whether we're talking about trees or animal products, food, any of those things are all scarce. They're all resources that we only have a certain amount of. And so how do we best allocate our capital and our tools and our production processes to meet the demands of the most number of people? We have no idea unless we have prices and profits and free markets that work together to allocate those resources towards the best suited demands of people around the world. So it's the areas where we see a lack of prices that we don't get that feedback and we don't get that communication about what people want and how much we have of that good or service. And we see all sorts of shortages. The road system is a system where there are no prices. And so we see people standing in line all the time. We see shortages of the road. People are sitting in their car in traffic because there's not enough of road to meet the supply of those consumers. Water, we see the same exact thing. We see shortages occur because the government has imposed a particular price that is below what the market would have otherwise provided that service at. So the more that we can extend this price and profit system to resources and areas of the economy that we don't currently have prices in, we are going to see a much better allocation of resources towards people's demands. We're going to see less people waiting around and twiddling their thumbs and hoping that resources will be delivered to them. We will see a much more efficient allocation and reorganization of the economy in the service of the most number of people that we can possibly serve, which is, on our planet, millions and billions of people. So I hope you enjoyed this. This has been a presentation of the Austrian Circle. We'll be back next week. I hope you have a great week. Take care.